He was doing his usual nightly rounds when he noticed a strange bulge on the basketball court. When workers opened it up, the school had to be evacuated. Look what one decision by a security guard led to. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The night had always belonged to Thomas Reed. It lived differently than the day, breathing in long, measured intervals, pacing itself through the empty corridors of the sports complex with a quiet patience that he had long ago grown accustomed to. To him, this building asleep in the darkness was not frightening and never lonely. It was simply another kind of living creature, one that he had learned to understand, step by step, shift by shift, over the 7 years he had been guarding it. He could read its subtleties the way a seasoned mariner read the surface of a still ocean, knowing that faint tremors hid deeper stories beneath. It was almost 3 a.m, that strange hour when even the city's distant hum fell silent and the world seemed suspended just slightly outside of time. Thomas moved with the calm efficiency of a man who had done this walk thousands of times before. The beam of his flashlight slid along the tiled hallway, catching the faint sheen of cleaning solution left behind by the evening crew, then traveled upward to the exposed steel rafters that groaned occasionally as the night's cold brought their old metal joints into slow contraction. His boots made soft, deliberate taps against the floor, each step measured, steady, unhurried. This shift suited him. It demanded alertness, certainty, and a kind of inner quiet he had never managed to find anywhere else. The complex, with its wide gyms, narrow locker room corridors, humid pools, and echoing practice spaces, was a world he knew intimately. During the day, it was a place of noise-shouting children, bouncing balls, coaches giving instructions, whistles piercing the air. But at night, it shed all that frantic energy and settled into something older, deeper, almost contemplative. This was when Thomas felt he fit into it best. He walked past the swimming pool entrance, inhaling the faint chemical sting of chlorine. Even with the door closed, it seeped out into the hallway, just enough to tangle with the lingering sense of wood polish and rubber from the basketball courts. Everything was normal. It always was, at this hour, because he made sure of it. Order and predictability were the anchors he relied on, ever since the military had left him with more memories than he wanted, and less sleep than he needed. Nights like these, when nothing disturbed the flow of routine, steadied him. They were the closest thing he knew to peace. He checked the security monitors in the lobby alcove, brushing a hand over the slightly dusty frame of the oldest screen, the one that flickered when the building temperature dropped too sharply. It was still working fine tonight. He glanced at the clock. 2:48 a.m. In another 12 minutes, he'd begin the second full walkthrough of the shift. He took a slow breath, letting it settle him, then resumed his path down the long hallway toward the gymnasium wing. The first hint that this night would not be like the others reached him so quietly he nearly missed it. As he turned the corner toward the maintenance section, something faint, a tremor, a suggestion more than a sensation, brushed against the soles of his boots. He paused, frowning down at the floor, as if expecting it to show him an answer. It was nothing more than a soft ripple, subtle enough that it could easily have been imagination. And yet, it wasn't. He knew the feel of this building better than he knew the patterns of his own scars, and this did not belong. He crouched, placing his palm against the cool tile. The vibration faded instantly. He waited, counting out slow seconds, watching the quiet hallway, as though expecting some sign of motion to reveal itself. Just as he was about to rise, the tremor returned, still mild, still nearly imperceptible, but undeniably there. A deep, muted thrum, like the faintest echo of distant machinery buried far beneath the floor. Thomas stood again, his posture shifting subtly. He didn't panic. Panic had been trained out of him long before his hair had begun to turn gray. Instead, he reached into the tool pocket on his belt and clicked on his smaller flashlight, sweeping the beam along the corners of the hallway, the air vents, the seams where floor met wall. Nothing was out of place. The building breathed its normal, slow, nighttime breath. Probably the boiler, he thought. The old one sometimes had mood swings in the colder months. But even as he headed toward the boiler room to check, a part of him already doubted the explanation. That vibration hadn't felt like pipes or machinery. It had felt organic, rhythmic, in a strangely measured way. The boiler room greeted him with the familiar blast of heat from the aging unit, its pipes thrumming softly with the movement of hot water. He checked pressure gauges, temperature readings, flow valves. Everything sat within normal range. Nothing sputtered. Nothing hissed. Nothing shuddered. The old beast was behaving tonight. But the floor under his feet still held a hint of the earlier tremor. He exhaled slowly, turning back toward the hallway. It wasn't enough to raise an alarm yet. Buildings shifted. Foundations complained. His job wasn't to imagine problems, but to anticipate danger. And danger did not come from vague vibrations alone. Still, something in his gut and instinct that had been honed in desert winds and cramped barracks told him the night had just changed. He made his way down toward the basketball wing, where the largest gym sat like a quiet cathedral of echoing wood and steel. As he approached the double doors, the flashlight beam skimmed along the glossy floor beneath the narrow gap at the bottom, catching a distortion in the reflection. It was subtle, a warped bend in the way the light traveled across the polished surface, as though the floor inside wasn't perfectly flat. He stopped. The building was dark, but the gym was never entirely lightless. High windows always allowed in scraps of moonlight or the faint reflection of street lamps. That normally created thin, steady bars of brightness on the court's lacquered surface. But tonight, the light seemed to curve in a way that made no sense. He pulled the heavy door open, and the sight on the other side instantly froze him in place. The floor, the familiar, polished basketball floor he had walked across hundreds of times, was not a floor anymore. At the center of the room, rising with impossible smoothness, was a dome. A perfect, swollen mound pushing upward from beneath the court. Nearly 2 feet high already, perhaps higher. Its surface gleamed in the faint spill of exterior light, distorted by the unnatural curve. The painted lines of the court bent and twisted as they followed the shape of the rise, making it look like some strange, inflated membrane rather than solid wood. Thomas stepped inside, the sound of his boots seeming muted by the vastness of the room. The air felt different here, heavier, warmer. He approached slowly, keeping the flashlight angled downward to avoid sweeping too much heat toward anything that might react to it. As he got closer to the dome, he felt it. Warmth radiating upward, gentle, but wrong for a cold winter night inside an unheated gym. He extended a hand, laying his palm gently on the curved surface. The heat was unmistakable now. Not hot like machinery or lighting equipment, hot like something alive. Something generating its own energy. And beneath the surface, through the wood, he felt another faint tremor. No, not a tremor. A pulse. He jerked his hand back before he could stop himself. The sensation had been so unexpected, so deeply unnatural, that it sent a chill up his spine. He stared at the dome, breath shallow for a moment, trying to steady himself. This was no simple flooring issue. Floors buckled from moisture or rot or shifting slabs, but they didn't rise in perfect curvature. They didn't grow evenly without splintering. They didn't feel warm, and they certainly didn't seem to throb with a strange internal rhythm. He leaned down again, narrowing his eyes. Fine cracks had begun to spiderweb across the varnish, tiny white fractures that radiated outward from the dome's peak. They weren't deep, yet, but they proved one thing. The pressure beneath was increasing. He felt a flicker of dizziness then, not from fear, but from the air itself. His tongue tasted faintly of metal, like the aftertaste of biting a coin. He inhaled slightly through his nose. There was something else in the air, too, something faint and sharp. This wasn't normal oxygen. He straightened, forcing himself to think clearly. His gaze swept the gym again, taking in every detail. The bleachers, the far wall, the ventilation grates, the emergency exits. The building remained silent, obedient in every other aspect. Only the dome broke the pattern. He stepped back slowly, trying not to breathe too deeply. Gas. It had to be some type of gas. Methane? Something industrial? He needed confirmation. He left the gym, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. His heartbeat felt strangely loud in the hallway, though he wasn't sure whether it was adrenaline or lingering dizziness. He walked with purpose toward the small equipment storage room near the security office. Inside, shoved behind crates of spare uniforms and decades-old sporting equipment, was a gray case he hadn't opened in years. He tugged it free, dust rising around his knees as he set it down. He flipped the clasps. Inside lay a portable gas detector, a relic from some forgotten safety program, but still intact. He checked the power, relieved to see it flicker awake with an electronic hum. He held it for a moment, letting its familiar weight settle him, then turned back toward the gym. When he opened the doors again, he felt. He didn't know how he felt. As though the room was watching him. As though the dome had grown slightly taller in the minutes he'd been gone. The mind played tricks, he told himself. Darkness played tricks. But the hair on the back of his neck prickled in warning. He approached again, slower this time. The detector beeped softly in his hand as he lifted it toward the cracks. Then the beeping quickened. Numbers jumped on the screen. 5, 12, 20, 40. The machine shrilled suddenly, an alarm the device had never once given during his years here. He stared at the flashing red display methane concentration far above safe levels. He knew immediately what that meant. The floor wasn't rising because of expanding wood or shifting foundations. It was rising because something beneath it was pushing up with enormous pressure caused by trapped gas, years or decades of buildup finding its first point of escape. Methane was odorless, invisible. People died from it every year without detecting it. And if enough of it pooled in an enclosed space, one spark could ignite it. Not a flame-eddy spark, a static discharge, a faulty wire, even certain metals scraping. He looked at the windows, at the light fixtures, at the scoreboard wiring. He imagined the morning staff turning on lights, the kids running across the court, a spark from a frayed wire. He imagined the explosion. He backed away from the dome, his mind calculating quickly now. He needed to isolate the gym. Shut down electricity, ventilate if possible, call for emergency services. He needed to act fast. The building, his quiet companion through so many sleepless nights, suddenly felt like a ticking bomb. He stepped into the hallway again, taking one last glance back at the dome. The wood gleamed strangely in the dim reflection. For a moment, he didn't know why. He thought he saw the surface shift. A tiny movement, subtle but real. The air in the hallway felt heavier now, too. Everything in his instincts, sharpened by years of military service and countless near disasters, told him one truth. Something underneath that gym floor was not just dangerous. It was alive in its own way. Moving, changing, growing. He turned toward the main corridor, already planning his next steps. There was no more room for hesitation. The building he knew so well had spoken, and he understood what it meant. Tonight, the danger had woken up before the city did, and he was the only one standing between it and everyone who would walk through these doors at dawn. The moment Thomas stepped out of the gym and allowed the heavy doors to fall shut behind him, the hallway felt different. The silence was the same as every other night, yet something inside it had shifted. The air was thicker than before, holding a weight that had nothing to do with temperature or humidity. He paused, letting the sense of the building settle around him, trying to understand why everything felt so subtly altered. The answer came almost immediately. It was him. He had changed. He had crossed a threshold in that gym, and now every instinct he had was awake in a way they had not been for years. He could still feel the warmth of the dome on his palm, lingering like a memory he did not want. The rhythmic pulse beneath the wood echoed in his mind with alarming clarity, each beat a reminder that he was standing inside a structure being quietly, relentlessly undermined. The gas detector in his hand continued to blink warnings at him, its digital numbers hovering in the red zone, even out here in the hall. That alone was enough to tell him that the gas was spreading, seeping beyond the boundaries of the gym and into the surrounding air. He closed his eyes briefly and forced his breathing to stay steady. Panic was the one thing he could not afford. Panic clouded thought. Clouded thought led to mistakes, and mistakes in a situation like this could cost lives. He had known pressure before, in deserts, where ambushes happened with the speed of gunfire, on nights when patrols went quiet, and the silence meant death was somewhere nearby. He had learned to listen, to act without hesitation, to stay grounded even when the world tilted into chaos. That training resurfaced now like a long-buried instinct waking from sleep, sharpening his awareness, tightening his focus until the corridors around him seemed unnervingly clear. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 3:07 a.m. Dawn was still distant, but time no longer felt abundant. In just a few hours, the building would begin to stir with life maintenance staff, early morning athletes, coaches arriving before their teams. At this very moment, none of them knew that beneath the polished gym floor was a swelling dome of pressure strong enough to turn the entire complex into a crater. If he waited too long, even a single person turning on a light switch could ignite a spark. He could not allow that possibility to become reality. His first step was straightforward. Electricity had to be cut before someone accidentally triggered a disaster. He started down the corridor with purposeful strides. The main breaker room was on the opposite side of the building, tucked behind a metal door that always stuck in cold weather. As he walked, another faint tremor quivered through the floor beneath him. Slight, but enough to confirm what he already knew. The pressure under the gym was rising, perhaps faster than he had assumed. He quickened his pace. The hallway lights flickered slightly as he passed, responding to some subtle change in the building's wiring system. Or perhaps it was just his eyes. The dizziness returned in brief waves, making the edges of his vision blur. The metallic taste grew sharper, scratching at the back of his throat like something trying to claw its way up. He swallowed, refusing to let discomfort distract him. He would deal with whatever gas seeped past his guard later, after he ensured no one else would breathe it. When he reached the breaker room, he pulled out the key ring clipped to his belt. The familiar weight of it steadied him. The lock resisted, as it always did, but gave way after a firm twist. The door creaked open to reveal the cramped, metal-lined room where the building's electrical heart pulsed in orderly rows of switches and panels. The breaker panel for the gymnasium wing sat along the right wall, each switch labeled with tiny strips of white tape, the letters faded, but readable under the beam of his flashlight. He stepped inside and shut the door behind him to avoid any cold draft stirring dust into the machinery. For a moment, he simply stood there, letting the hum of electricity fill his ears. It had always been a strangely comforting sound, steady, predictable, alive without being threatening. Tonight, it carried a different undertone. The hum felt fragile, as though the wires themselves sensed the danger brewing in the building. He raised his hand and gripped the main lever for the gymnasium wing. It was a heavy switch, one that required real effort to pull down. He braced his feet and tugged sharply. The metal arm snapped down with a loud clunk that echoed off the narrow walls. The hum in the breaker room faltered, then returned, but diminished. He could feel the change immediately. Somewhere in the building, the gymnasium wing had gone dark. Whatever minor sparks or currents might have threatened ignition were now gone. He allowed the smallest breath of relief, though relief was far too premature a word to use. Killing the power had been the easiest part. What came next was far more difficult. He had to isolate the gym so completely that no one could accidentally enter. And after that, he had to somehow bring emergency services into the equation without making a single mistake that could generate a spark. The hallway outside the breaker room felt colder now, emptier. Thomas made his way back toward the gym, his flashlight sweeping across the polished floors. He could see the faint distortion beneath the gym doors, even from a distance. The subtle curvature of light along the dome's surface, visible through the narrow bottom gap. He walked up to the doors and studied the handles. The metal felt warm beneath his fingertips, warmed not by the building, but by whatever lay beneath the court. He retrieved 2 of the metal security bars from the storage closet nearby. These were usually used only during major events to restrict access to wings of the building. But tonight, they served a different purpose. With practiced movements, he slid the bars through the reinforced slots built into the doorframe, securing both handles in place. Once they locked, the doors were immovable, even from the inside. He added 2 padlocks for good measure, pulling hard on each to ensure no unexpected give. He stepped back, considering. This would stop casual entry, but morning staff were creatures of habit. They might try other doors. He needed more than locks. He needed visible, unavoidable barricades. He turned and headed down the hallway toward a series of tall metal cubbies used to store sports equipment during tournaments. They were heavy, sturdy enough that even 3 people pushing together had difficulty moving them. Perfect. He dragged the first one into place across the gym entrance, the metal legs screeching slightly against the floor. The sound echoed far more loudly than he anticipated, bouncing off the walls like an alarm. He winced, then continued. The second cubby went next to the first, forming a wall of steel in front of the doors. Then he added a folded bleacher section, anything that would make the hallway impassable. When he finished, the entrance looked like a fortified barrier. No one, not even the most determined person, would enter out of curiosity or habit. He took out a marker from his belt pouch and quickly scribbled a large sign on a piece of cardboard. Danger. Do not enter. Emergency maintenance. He taped it to the front of the barricade, though he doubted anyone would even see the doors behind the wall of metal. He felt a slight ache in his chest then, not from strain, but from the lingering effects of the gas he had breathed in the gym. His breath hitched for a moment. He steadied himself, leaning one hand against the wall until the dizziness passed. It wasn't severe, not yet, but it reminded him that time was running faster than he wanted to admit. He needed to make the call. He tried his phone, glancing down at the signal bars. Nothing. Not even a flicker. The building's structure-thick concrete, decades-old foundations had always been a nuisance for reception, but tonight it felt like an active obstacle. The gas, the dome, the tension humming through the walls, all of it made the air feel heavy enough to choke off connection. He knew what he had to do. The roof. The rooftop access ladder wasn't far, just a few turns down another hallway, behind a door marked Maintenance Only. The exterior height often provided a better signal, free from the interference buried deep within the building's shell. He set off toward it, passing through familiar corridors that suddenly felt foreign. Every shadow seemed sharper, every sound more deliberate. He caught himself listening for the tremors beneath his feet, wondering if they would intensify. The building groaned once, a long, low sigh that could have been anything from thermal expansion to structural strain. But it traveled along the floor in a way that made the hair on his arms rise. He reached the maintenance door and unlocked it. The ladder stretched upward into darkness, the metal worn smooth in the center from years of hands climbing it during inspections. He grabbed the rung and pulled himself up. The climb wasn't long, but each step felt heavier than it should have. The dizziness returned halfway up, forcing him to pause as the world dipped slightly sideways. He clenched his jaw and continued until he reached the hatch. When he pushed it open, cold night air flooded over him. The roof was quiet, except for the faint whistle of wind threading through the vents. He stepped onto the gravel surface and drew a deep breath, letting the crisp air clear his head. This high above ground, the stars felt closer, sharper. The moon hung low, washed in pale light that gave the rooftop an otherworldly glow. He pulled out his phone again. Signal bars returned instantly. 2, then 3. It was enough. He dialed emergency services. The ring sounded like a lifeline stretching out into the darkness. When the operator answered, her voice steady and professional, he explained everything. Not the minimal version, everything. The domed floor, the heat, the rhythmic vibration, the methane readings, the structural risk, the potential for explosion. His tone was calm but firm, carrying the weight of someone who had seen danger and knew its shape well enough to trust his instincts without question. At first, the operator responded with the cautious neutrality of someone fielding a late-night call from a stranger, reporting something unusual. But as Thomas continued, her voice shifted. She asked specific follow-up questions, confirmed the location, asked him to repeat the gas detector readings. When he did, she fell silent for a moment. Then the tone of the call changed. She spoke quickly, telling him that fire units were being dispatched immediately, followed by a geological hazard response team. Relief mingled with urgency inside him. Help was coming, but time was still the enemy. He ended the call and looked out over the quiet parking lot. Nothing moved below. The complex was dark, peaceful, only minutes removed from becoming a death trap. The weight of that knowledge pressed on him more heavily than any physical symptom. He climbed back down the ladder, shutting the rooftop hatch with deliberate care to avoid producing sparks. Once back inside the hallway, the air felt heavier than before, as though the building itself sensed what was coming. A faint hiss whispered somewhere in the distance, perhaps a misaligned vent, perhaps something else entirely. His flashlight beam found no cause, but the sound lingered with him as he walked. He returned to the gym doors long enough to check the barricade. Everything remained in place. The gas detector, still in his hand, blinked with relentless warnings. He didn't dare open the doors again. He didn't need to. The situation inside was worsening whether he looked at it or not. Before the emergency crews arrived, he moved through the building's eastern wing to access a row of emergency ventilation controls that had been installed decades earlier during a renovation. They were seldom used, but he knew where they were and how they operated. The valves were stiff with age, requiring strength to turn, but slowly, with effort, he pried them open. The stale air in the wing began to move, the faintest of currents flowing through the vents, where it could disperse harmlessly into the open world outside. His breath grew ragged after the exertion, but he steadied himself once more. The work had to be done. He followed the faint shift in airflow back toward the hallway near the gym. The tremor beneath his feet had grown slightly more noticeable, still subtle, still far from violent, but increasing with an undeniable rhythm. The floor felt warmer under his boots, than it had earlier. He imagined the dome growing upwards during the short time he had been gone, the cracks widening, the wood straining, a giant invisible fist pushing against the underside of the gym floor. The mental image was vivid enough to make him tighten his grip on the flashlight until his knuckles whitened. He took another look at the clock. 3:48 a.m. Less than an hour had passed, yet it felt as though he had lived through a condensed lifetime of decisions, all made in the space between breaths. As he stood there in the dim hallway, listening to the building's uneasy whispers, the faint, distant sound of sirens finally broke the silence. They approached steadily from the main road, growing louder until they dominated the night outside. Red and blue lights splashed across the windows. Engines rumbled into the parking lot. Help had arrived. But even with professionals now stepping into the unfolding emergency, Thomas knew with cold clarity that the worst part of the night might still lie ahead. The dome was still rising. The gas was still seeping. The threat was still growing beneath a floor that was never meant to hold such pressure. The building was not yet done, revealing what hid beneath its surface. The arrival of the emergency crews did not dispel the tension that had settled over the sports complex. If anything, their presence deepened it. The parking lot outside filled with the rhythmic flash of red and blue lights, cutting through the darkness like restless, pulsing veins. Engines idled low, vibrating across the pavement, while firefighters and hazard specialists stepped out of their vehicles with the controlled urgency of people who understood that time was already against them. Their movements were confident, efficient, but beneath that lay the unmistakable thread of caution reserved for dangerous unknowns. Thomas stepped outside briefly to meet them. The cold night air, which had felt sharp and cleansing minutes earlier, now carried the weight of the building's unseen threat behind him. He took a deep breath as the first firefighter approached, a broad-shouldered man with steady eyes, who introduced himself quickly before asking for details. Thomas explained everything with the same calm focus he had maintained on the rooftop. He recited the gas readings, described the shape and behavior of the dome, outlined the warm temperature of the floor, and recounted the tremors that had traveled through the building. His voice remained even, but each detail hung in the air with a gravity impossible to ignore. The commander listened without interruption. His expression shifted in minute increments, tightening slightly at the mention of methane readings, hardening as Thomas described the rhythmic vibration. The commander glanced toward the building, and Thomas knew, without any need for spoken confirmation, that the man understood what this situation could become. A methane buildup under pressure was more than a structural hazard. It was a bomb awaiting a trigger. Within minutes, a small team of specialists had gathered near the entrance, carrying portable scanning devices and protective gear. Thomas guided them toward the barricaded hallway. The closer they got, the more the atmosphere changed. The air near the gym doors was warmer than the rest of the complex, tinged with the faintest sulfuric sharpness that hadn't been present earlier. Even those without detectors sensed it. The building felt alive beneath their feet, as if the dome had become a second heartbeat resonating through the structure. The specialists paused just shy of the barricade. They began setting up their equipment with a practiced coordination that lent an illusion of order to the danger surrounding them. Thomas watched as one of the geologists adjusted the settings on ground-penetrating radar, the device emitting a series of soft, calibrating tones. Another crew member set down a thermal camera, sweeping its lens slowly across the sealed gym doors. The screen lit up with colors: blues, greens, yellows, and a large, unmistakable bloom of red at the center of what lay behind the wood and metal. Heat. Significant heat. The radar device hummed as its antenna extended. The geologist crouched, reading the lines that began forming across the digital display. Thomas leaned slightly to see, though he knew nothing of interpreting the waves and signals. The geologist didn't speak for a long moment, following the pattern, mapping it in his mind, comparing it to the structural diagram he had pulled up on a tablet. Finally, he exhaled, glancing up at the commander. "There's something massive beneath the gym floor." The statement was simple, but its impact hit harder than the cold wind that brushed past them. The geologist didn't dramatize his findings. He didn't have to. The flattened tone of his voice carried enough weight. He explained that the radar showed a dense object, denser than concrete, resting within a hollow chamber directly under the dome. The object had shifted upward significantly, displacing the layers above it and trapping gas in a compressed chamber. The shape was irregular, but unmistakably natural. A boulder, perhaps the size of a small car, forced upward by geological pressure. Thomas felt the answer click into place. The old technician's story had not been rumor or exaggeration. The complex truly had been built over sealed underground chambers. Remnants of industrial excavation or forgotten geological work. Those chambers had held their silence for decades, suffocating under the weight of cement, steel, and time. Now, something had cracked, and centuries-old methane deposits were leaking upward into the one place they could go: the gym floor. The specialists conferred in quiet voices. They spoke of gas pockets, fault lines, shifting stone. One of them theorized that groundwater movement had eroded part of the cavity beneath the boulder, allowing it to descend slightly before being forced upward by the pressure of gas trapped below. Another asked about seismic readings from earlier in the month. Their discussion was methodical, clinical, but beneath it, Thomas sensed the shared realization that they were working against an unstable mechanism no human hand had built. The commander asked for a plan of action, and the geologist responded almost immediately. The pressure beneath the gym had to be lowered. They needed to release the methane in a controlled manner before the dome rose further or ruptured. The team prepared their equipment drills designed for precision, hoses, and containment units capable of storing concentrated gas without risk of ignition. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture matched by a second glance or a confirming nod. No one rushed, because rushing was as dangerous as waiting. Thomas stood to the side, but his presence remained central. When the specialists asked about the internal layout of the gym, he described the exact placement of beams, supports, and conduits. When they asked where the floor was thickest, he pointed. When they sought confirmation of the building's retrofitting history, he gave them what he remembered from old maintenance logs he had once read simply to pass time. His knowledge guided their decisions more than once. He had not realized until this night how deeply the building's structure was etched into his memory. The team began drilling. The sound was muffled but steady, a controlled intrusion into the tense silence of the hallway. The bit cut through the wood and concrete slowly, avoiding the center of the dome in favor of a reinforced area near its base, where the structure could tolerate minor alterations. It was a process that required absolute precision, and everyone present seemed to hold their breath as the drill descended into the floor. A sudden sharp hiss erupted when the bit broke through the final layer. The sound was startling at first, a quick, angry release of pressure. But the specialists reacted instantly. They secured the hose attachment to the hole, tightening clamps, sealing the escape route. Gas surged into the containment unit with a force that made the hose tremble. The reading on the technician's handheld monitor jumped by a wide margin, reflecting the sudden drop of pressure inside the dome. Thomas watched the containment unit fill, its reinforced tank absorbing the methane that had been building for decades. Another unit was attached. Then a third. The hiss slowly began to soften, settling into a steady whisper. The atmosphere in the hallway changed with it. The heat emanating from the doorframe faded slightly. The low tremor beneath their feet diminished until it became a barely perceptible quiver instead of a pulse. When the pressure dropped to manageable levels, the team stopped drilling and began sealing the hole. Their movements were careful, their expressions guarded. No one allowed themselves the comfort of relief, not until every reading confirmed that the danger had passed. The commander finally turned to Thomas. "You prevented a disaster tonight," he said, not as praise, but as a statement of fact. "If that floor had risen any farther, or if someone had switched on the lights in the morning." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Thomas nodded once, though his emotions remained tightly bound beneath the surface. Relief did not wash over him the way it did for the others. He felt only a muted awareness that the worst had been avoided for now. But he had lived long enough to know that the aftermath of danger often required its own kind of strength. By sunrise, the parking lot was crowded with additional vehicles engineers, city officials, investigative teams. The gym remained sealed, its entrance now cordoned off with barricades far heavier and more official than the ones Thomas had built. The building was evacuated, its entrances guarded, its interior echoing with the footsteps of professionals conducting residual gas checks. The mayor arrived shortly after 8, still in formal attire from an appearance he had attended earlier that morning. He shook Thomas's hand, thanked him for his vigilance, promised commendations, and spoke of community safety. Photographers snapped pictures. Reporters asked questions. Thomas answered what he could, but his expression remained unchanged. Calm, composed, slightly distant. He knew that the story of his actions would circulate in the news, that his name might be mentioned with words like hero or guardian. But he felt none of the swelling pride such words were meant to inspire. His thoughts drifted back to the moment he touched the dome, to the warmth, the pulse, the movement beneath the wood. He wondered how close things had been to crossing a point of no return. He imagined the explosion, how the wood would have shattered, how the walls would have collapsed, how the air would have ignited. He imagined bodies in the wreckage, flames rising where children would have gathered. He imagined the aftermath, but none of those images came with relief at having prevented them. Instead, they came with a quiet weight that settled over him like a familiar coat. He remained on duty even after his shift officially ended. No one asked him to. He simply stayed, watching the crews work, watching the building breathe again without the threat hidden beneath its skin. He walked the hallways slowly, feeling their familiar settling, listening to the old structure's groans and shivers with the same attention he always had. By early afternoon, most responders had left. The gym was still sealed, scheduled for days, if not weeks, of excavation and repair. The rest of the complex remained closed until further notice. Thomas finally allowed himself to sit on the bench outside the security office. Sunlight streamed through the windows, sharp and clear, illuminating the dust in the air. For the first time since the night began, he felt the exhaustion creep into his bones. When his next shift began at dusk, he returned as he always did. The halls were quieter than usual, emptied by caution and restricted access. He walked them slowly, letting the darkness embrace him once more. The barricaded gym doors stood ahead, still locked, still sealed. He reached out and placed his hand against the cool metal. The warmth was gone. The pulse was gone. Only silence remained. But in that silence, he sensed something deeper, the reminder that buildings did not stay still forever. They shifted, changed, revealed secrets only to those who listened closely enough. He lowered his hand and continued walking, the echo of his footsteps traveling softly ahead of him. The night reclaimed the complex, and with it, the strange kind of peace he had always found in the quiet. Yet he understood now, with a clarity sharpened by the previous hours, that peace was never guaranteed. Not in buildings, not in people, not anywhere. But so long as he was here, watching, listening, noticing the things others overlooked, there would always be someone to catch the whisper before it became a roar. Someone to read the tremor beneath the floor. Someone to stand between silence and catastrophe. And so Thomas Reed walked into the deepening shadows of the hallway, ready for whatever the next night would reveal. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next stories. Watch our other videos to see what happens in the ones you haven't checked out yet, and share this video with your friends so they can see it too.